One of the hardest truths for an avoidant person to face is that they often misjudge people who love deeply. Not because those people lack value, but because avoidants tend to interpret emotional consistency through the lens of fear rather than clarity. When someone shows patience, understanding, and emotional availability, they are more likely to be able to help someone in need. The avoidant mind frequently translates that into something ordinary, predictable, or endlessly accessible. And what feels endlessly accessible is rarely appreciated in the moment. That was the mistake they made with you. They looked at your calmness and thought it meant you would never leave. They looked at your willingness to communicate and assumed you would always keep fixing the connection no matter how little effort they gave in return. They saw your emotional depth, but instead of recognizing it as strength, they interpreted it as emotional dependence. This is one of the great psychological blind spots of avoidance. They confuse stability with weakness because chaos feels more emotionally familiar to them than peace does. And that misunderstanding changes the entire dynamic. You have to understand avoidants are often internally disconnected from the full weight of emotional experiences while they are happening. In the moment, distancing themselves feels logical. Pulling away feels safe. Minimizing attachment feels like self-protection. So when conflicts arise or emotional intimacy deepens, they instinctively retreat instead of reflecting. They convince themselves that the connection was not as meaningful as it truly was because acknowledging the depth of it would require vulnerability, and vulnerability is precisely what they spend most of their lives trying to control. But reality has a way of exposing emotional truth over time. The moment you stopped over-explaining yourself, the moment you stopped chasing clarity, the moment you became silent instead of reactive, something shifted psychologically for them. Because now they were no longer interacting with your effort. They were forced to sit alone with your absence, and absence has a strange way of revealing value. When you were there, your support became part of their emotional environment. Familiar, constant, expected. But once that energy disappeared, they began noticing the emptiness in places they once overlooked. The conversations became shallower. The emotional company connection with others felt temporary and performative. They started realizing that what you gave them emotionally was not common at all. This is where regret begins forming, not through dramatic heartbreak at first, but through comparison, quiet comparison. They begin comparing your sincerity to superficial interactions, your emotional intelligence to emotional inconsistency, your patience to emotional games. And slowly, almost unwillingly, they start recognizing something uncomfortable. They were loved more genuinely than they allowed themselves to admit. That realization can deeply unsettle an avoidant person because it forces them to confront the role they played in losing the connection. And avoidants often spend years emotionally protecting themselves from guilt, accountability, and emotional exposure. So when clarity finally arrives, it does not feel empowering. It feels haunting, because now they understand something they could not understand before. You were not trying to control them. You were trying to connect with them. That changes everything. Many avoidants spend a long time believing that emotional closeness automatically leads to pressure, loss of freedom, or etc. Emotional overwhelm. So when someone genuinely loves them, they instinctively search for flaws, distance themselves emotionally, or convince themselves they are not ready. But after enough time passes, they often realize the problem was never your love. The problem was their inability to receive it without fear. And this is why they return mentally before they return physically. Long before a message arrives, before a phone call, before they attempt reconnection, there is usually an internal period where they replay memories differently. Conversations start sounding different in hindsight. Your intentions become clearer. Moments they once dismissed suddenly carry emotional weight. They begin recognizing the emotional safety they once took for granted. And perhaps the most painful part for them is realizing that you were offering peace while they were preparing for abandonment that never actually came from you. That is the tragedy of avoidance. They spend so much time protecting themselves from imagined pain that they end up creating real loss. But by the time they finally see your value clearly, something within you has already started changing too. Because being misunderstands, odd for too long transforms a person. It teaches you to stop proving your intentions to people committed to misunderstanding them. It teaches you that your value does not decrease simply because someone lacked the emotional maturity to recognize it in real time. And that is why their realization matters less than your awakening, because the moment you stop trying to convince them of your worth was the exact moment they finally began to see it themselves. Sometimes people only recognize the light after they are left sitting in the dark. What makes this experience even more psychologically intense for the avoidant is that your absence did not simply create distance, it created awareness. And awareness is something avoidant individuals spend much of their lives unconsciously postponing. At first, when the connection ended or weakened, they likely felt relief instead of grief. That confuses many people. You expect heartbreak to look emotional, dramatic, immediate, but avoidance rarely works that way. Their nervous system is trained to interpret emotional distance as safety. So in the beginning, they often distract themselves, detach intellectually, or convince themselves they, Drew, needed space. They bury themselves in work, routines, entertainment, new conversations, temporary excitement, anything that keeps them from fully sitting with emotion. And for a short period of time, that strategy appears to work. But emotional suppression is not emotional resolution. That is the difference. What is buried psychologically does not disappear. It waits. And eventually silence begins doing what confrontation could not do. It forces reflection. This is the stage where your absence becomes impossible to ignore. Not because you were constantly demanding attention, but because your emotional presence had become woven into their internal world more deeply than they realized. Human beings often underestimate what consistently nourishes them until it disappears. We notice pain immediately, but we notice peace only after it is gone. That is exactly what starts happening to them. The avoidant slowly begins encountering emotional contrasts everywhere. Conversations that once seemed exciting now feel shallow. Connections that looked easier now feel emotionally empty. They begin realizing how rare it was to feel genuinely understood by someone who was not trying to manipulate, manipulate, impress, or emotionally control them. And this realization often arrives in ordinary moments, not dramatic ones. A quiet evening. A difficult day with no one who truly understands them. A conversation with someone emotionally unavailable in the exact way they once were with you. Life begins mirroring their own behavior back to them, and suddenly they experience the emotional confusion they once caused you. That is when the lesson deepens, because your absence did something powerful. It removed emotional certainty, and avoidants often do not recognize value until certainty disappears. As long as they believe someone will remain emotionally available no matter how inconsistently they behave, there is little urgency for self-reflection. But once they feel your emotional energy truly withdrawing, the psychological equation changes completely. Now the loss feels real. Now they begin replaying moments they once minimized. Your patience, your efforts to communicate, the emotional grace you gave them during times when they were distant, cold, or emotionally confusing. And with each memory comes a growing awareness that they may have misinterpreted strength as weakness. This, Drew, is one of the deepest ironies in avoidant psychology. They often admire emotional resilience only after they have pushed it away. You see, emotionally mature people do not always announce their value loudly. Sometimes their value exists in subtle things: consistency, emotional regulation, sincerity, calmness, reliability. But avoidants are frequently conditioned to respond more intensely to emotional unpredictability because unpredictability keeps intimacy at a safe distance. Healthy love can initially feel unfamiliar to someone accustomed to emotional instability. So when they encountered your steadiness, part of them unconsciously devalued it. Not because it lacked meaning, but because it lacked chaos. Only later do they understand that peace was never boredom. Peace was emotional security. And once this realization takes hold, regret becomes heavier than they expected. Because now they are not simply missing a person. They are confronting the possibility that they abandoned something authentic while chasing emotional comfort. That realization can become psychologically consuming. Many avoidants secretly believe that if they create enough distance, their feelings will fade. Drew, naturally. But often the opposite happens. Distance removes distraction, and when distractions disappear, emotional truth becomes louder. The mind starts revisiting unresolved memories, unfinished conversations, and emotional moments that once seemed insignificant. This is why they begin seeing you differently over time, not through fantasy but through contrast. They compare how emotionally safe they felt with you versus how emotionally disconnected they feel elsewhere. They compare your honesty to superficial attraction, your depth to temporary chemistry, your emotional intelligence to emotional avoidance. And slowly they begin realizing that the connection they left behind carried a level of sincerity they may never easily replace. But perhaps the most transformative part of this process is that your absence also changed you. While they were slowly awakening to what they lost, you were learning how to survive without waiting for them to understand your worth. You were learning emotional detachment, self-respect, and internal stability. The silence that forced them into reflection was the same silence that forced you into growth. And growth changes energy. By the time IDANTs fully recognize what your absence taught them, they often return to find that you are no longer emotionally standing in the same place where they left you. The version of you that once over-explained, overgave, or overweighted has evolved. And that evolution can shock them because it confronts them with something undeniable. You did not collapse without their validation. You transformed beyond it. And sometimes that becomes the very lesson they can never forget. Because absence does not only reveal who mattered, it reveals who was taken for granted. What becomes fascinating at this stage of the story is that the avoidance return is rarely as impulsive as people assume. From the outside, it can look sudden, a message out of nowhere, an unexpected apology, a renewed effort to reconnect. But psychologically, the return usually begins long before they ever reach out. It starts internally, in silence, during the period where reflection slowly replaces avoidance. And this is important to understand. Avoidants do not return simply because they are lonely. Loneliness alone is temporary. What pulls them back is realization. The realization that they misunderstood the connection, underestimated the person, and overestimated their ability to emotionally detach from something meaningful. That internal shift changes the energy of their return. Before, they operated from defense mechanisms. They kept emotional distance because vulnerability felt threatening. They withdrew when intimacy deepened because closeness activated fear instead of safety. They convinced themselves they needed freedom, space, or emotional independence, when in reality they were often running from emotional exposure. But eventually, life forces a confrontation with reality, and reality has a way of dismantling emotional illusions. They begin noticing that emotional detachment does not automatically create peace. In fact, many avoidants discover that constantly avoiding emotional depth creates a different kind of suffering isolation. They may have protected themselves from vulnerability, but they also protected themselves from genuine connection. And over time, that emotional numbness becomes exhausting. This is where transformation begins. Not dramatic transformation, not instant healing, but awareness. The kind of awareness that makes a person start questioning their own pattern, instead of blaming everyone else for emotional discomfort. They begin recognizing how often they withdrew from intimacy the moment something real appeared. They notice how they sabotaged closeness not because love was unsafe, but because emotional dependency terrified them. And perhaps for the first time, they stop viewing vulnerability as weakness. That changes everything. Because once avoidants begin understanding their own behavior, they also begin revisiting the people they pushed away unfairly. And your name rises to the surface because your presence represented something emotionally significant: stability without control, closeness without manipulation, care without emotional games. Now they can finally see that clearly. This is why their return often carries a different emotional tone than before. The conversations become softer, more intentional, more reflective. There is less ego in the interaction because reality has humbled them emotionally. The distance taught them something their defenses could not. Losing a genuine connection hurts more than facing vulnerability ever would have. And that realization creates the opportunity they now bring back toward you. But, here is where people misunderstand the word opportunity. They assume it only means romance. Sometimes it does. Sometimes they return ready to offer commitment where they once offered confusion. Sometimes they return finally willing to communicate honestly instead of disappearing emotionally. Sometimes they return wanting to rebuild trust they once took for granted. But the opportunity can also be deeper than that. Sometimes the opportunity is accountability. For perhaps the first time in their life, they are emotionally capable of admitting that they misjudged you, that they projected fears onto you that never belonged to you, that they interpreted your love through the lens of their own emotional wounds instead of seeing your intentions clearly. And psychologically, that is enormous growth for an avoidant individual. Because avoidants are often masters of emotional rationalization, they explain away discomfort. They intellectualize emotions instead of feeling them. They create distance rather than confronting guilt directly. So when an avoidant genuinely returns with self-awareness, it means they have crossed an internal threshold that once felt impossible to them. They no longer only protecting themselves from pain. They are finally confronting the pain they caused. And that confrontation reshapes identity. You see, people change most deeply not when they are forced to suffer, but when they are forced to see themselves clearly. That is what happened here. Your absence became the mirror they could no longer avoid looking into. And in that reflection, they saw not only what they lost, they saw the version of themselves that created the loss. That realization can humble even the most emotionally distant person. But what makes this moment truly powerful is that by the time they return, the emotional balance has shifted. Earlier in the connection, you may have been the one seeking clarity while they avoided it. You may have been the one trying to preserve the relationship while they emotionally drifted. But now they are the ones seeking reconnection. They are the ones trying to bridge emotional distance. And for the first time, they understand the weight of emotional uncertainty from the other side. That experience changes people. Because once someone truly understands the emotional cost of losing you, they can no longer view you casually. They may still struggle. They may still fear intimacy at times. But the illusion that you are easily replaceable is gone forever. Now they know what your absence feels like. Now they understand that genuine emotional connection is not something endlessly available in life. It is rare, fragile, deeply human. And when mishandled, it leaves lessons that follow people for years. This is why their return matters less for what they say and more for what they finally understand. Because words can be impulsive, but awareness changes behavior. And sometimes the most powerful apology is not emotion alone, it is transformation. But perhaps the most important transformation in this entire story is not the avoidance awakening. It is yours. Because while they were slowly confronting regret, confusion, and emotional realization, you were being forced into a completely different kind of evolution. An evolution that did not begin with empowerment, but with disappointment. At first, you probably wanted understanding more than distance. You wanted honesty more than separation. You wanted clarity more than silence. Like many emotionally sincere people, you believed that if you explained why, ourselves clearly enough, loved deeply enough, or remained patient long enough, eventually they would recognize your intentions and meet you halfway. But eventually, something inside you changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually through exhaustion. There comes a moment in every emotionally imbalanced connection where a person realizes they can no longer carry the emotional weight for two people. And that realization is painful because it forces you to confront something difficult. Love alone cannot create mutual emotional availability. No matter how genuine your intentions are, you cannot heal someone through self-sacrifice. You cannot convince a fearful person to receive love before they are emotionally ready to face themselves. That understanding became the beginning of your transformation. And psychologically, this is where your power started returning. Because when people spend long periods trying to earn emotional consistency from someone avoidant, they often lose connection with themselves in the process. Their self-worth slowly becomes tied to emotional unpredictability. They begin measuring their value based on responses, attention, reassurance, or ional closeness that comes and goes inconsistently. Over time, this creates emotional dependency disguised as hope. But separation interrupts that cycle. The silence that once felt unbearable slowly becomes clarifying. You begin seeing patterns more objectively. You recognize how much emotional energy you spent trying to maintain a connection that required mutual effort to survive. And perhaps most importantly, you begin understanding that someone's inability to recognize your value is not evidence that you lacked value. That realization changes a person internally. Because once self-worth stops depending on external validation, emotional stability begins forming from within instead of from another person's behavior. And that is the moment your energy shifts completely. Avoidants sense this shift more than people realize. They are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are also highly sensitive to emotional detachment. Earlier, when your energy was focused on preserving the connection, they felt unconsciously in control of the emotional dynamic. They knew you were emotionally available. They knew part of you was still waiting, hoping, trying. But once you genuinely begin releasing emotional dependence, the dynamic changes in a way they cannot ignore. You stop chasing clarity. You stop over-explaining your intentions. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone determined not to fully see it. And suddenly, your absence feels emotionally real to them for the first time. This is why avoidants often return only after the other person has emotionally evolved beyond desperation. Not because it is manipulation, but because emotional detachment removes the pressure that once activated their fear. When your energy becomes calmer, grounded, and self-contained, they no longer feel emotionally cornered. Instead, they begin feeling the full weight of losing access to someone emotionally rare. And here is the deeper philosophical truth hidden underneath all of this. People often perceive value most clearly when attachment is no longer begging to be chosen. That is why your transformation matters more than their return. Because